Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
Episode 126, Family Feud. James turned and saw a few figures rushing towards them. He counted carefully. There were a total of 5 people. They were all men. They were dressed in suits and they looked similar to Durham, except their style was a bit more extravagant. They all wore thick gold necklaces around their necks, and on their fingers were large sapphire rings. James's first thought was of the nouveau riche he had come across in New York in the past. From their appearance, he was sure the 2 middle-aged men leading the group were related to Durham. Their faces were very similar, like they were brothers. The thinner of the 2 was a bit older, and his expression was relatively calm. The slightly fatter man had a wrinkled face and a full beard. He was tall and sturdy, and his appearance was rough. One look and you could tell that he had a fiery temper. James guessed that he was the one with the harsh voice. The 3 men with them were relatively young and keeping quiet in the background, but they were big and looked tough. Clearly they were the subordinates, and clearly this group had come with ill intentions. James's expression did not change. He only narrowed his eyes slightly. Then he took a step forward to block Krista, Katie, and Vanessa, by now to become a habit to protect them. The women once again appreciated this chivalric gesture. It gave them a warm feeling knowing James was thinking of their safety. Durham addressed the rugged middle-aged man calmly. His tone, however, was noticeably cold. "What's the matter, Draka?" he asked. With a fierce look in his eyes, Draka pointed his finger at Durham. "Have you asked your brother and me if we want to sell this company?" The man's question contained a lot of information. James was instantly able to understand what was going on. He just sighed and pulled the women in close. "No matter where you go, people are always the same, even between brothers. Money complicates everything." Although he did not want to get involved in this fight, the company was his. The system had purchased it for him. He needed to know what was going on, so he kept silent and listened. "It was Father's idea to sell the company," Durham said. "He asked me to do so. And besides, he is the chairman of the company. All the shares are under his name. Why should I ask you and David for permission?" The skinny man finally spoke. That old man has been holed up in bed for more than a year. Who knows if what you say is true?" He stared at Durham like a poisonous snake. It was easy to see he was a schemer. "I knew you would say that, David," Durham said. He took out a document, opened it with a shake of his hand, and gestured for them to read it themselves. "This is a commission written by our father. He entrusted me with the company's sale and all the follow-up matters. So unless you have anything else to say, please leave." David felt it was a trick. "You've been hiding that feeble old man in your house. How do we know you didn't forge that letter?" "That's right," Draka added in his rough voice. He was dressed in a tailored suit, but it seemed inappropriate somehow for his body, which made James uncomfortable. This guy was a bit like a stereotypical underworld boss in a TV crime show. If he were to find a role to play, he might even become famous, James mused. By now, he had sorted out the players in this little drama. These 3 were brothers. The slimmest and oldest was David. The bearded fat Draka was the second oldest, while their kind host from last night, Durham, was the youngest. Their father was the president of the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company. He was now incapacitated in bed and supported by Durham in his own home. The old man had entrusted all the matters of the company to his youngest son, but his siblings were not pleased and had come today to fight for their property. Although James was not privy to the family dynamics, from the way the 2 older brothers spoke of their father like he was already dead, he could see that they were lacking in character. Plus, no matter what Durham's goal was, he was the one who'd brought his father into his own home to support him in his old age. This alone showed that he was a loyal son, and no matter if it's New York or Madagascar, loyalty to family always comes first. Always. Therefore, James was slowly losing his position as a neutral bystander. He was on the youngest brother's side now. Durham was frustrated. Obviously, he had heard all this before. "Aye, I don't want to waste any more time with you. I need to tend to my guests, so excuse me." He signaled for James and the ladies to follow him into the building. James gladly did so. He couldn't wait to find out where the system's next mission spot would be. "What? You think your brother and I don't know?" Draka growled. "You're going to hand the company over to this guy." He snapped his fingers at the men behind him and pointed at Durham. "Get him! Bring him to me!" At this moment, greed and endless madness were in control. The two older brothers had been completely blinded by money. The three young toughs moved forward. Their steps were steady and quick. Although all were wearing suits, they looked like well-trained fighters. They grabbed Durham, who had a panicked look on his face, and dragged him to his brothers. Durham was struggling with all his might as he roared, "David, Draka, I've already told you. This is what Father wants. If you insist on doing this, I will call the police. Don't blame me for what will happen next." Even now, he was still thinking about their pitiful bond of kinship. Draka slapped Durham across the face to shut his mouth. The younger man still did not understand that this was a conspiracy his two brothers had been cooking up for a long time. He was indeed so naive that even James could not bear to watch it any longer. But this was a family matter in a foreign country. He did not want to get involved. As far as he was concerned, he was just a bystander to this farce. As long as it did not affect his interests, he had nothing to gain by interfering in a family dispute. At this moment, they should have taken Durham and left to sort out the matter. But David suddenly pointed at James, who was standing at the door quietly watching all this, and said, "Take him too. And those women, them too." That's when James noticed another crew of thugs standing by some vehicles. The brothers had come to this little showdown today with full force. Immediately, a few guys from the group marched towards James and the ladies. The corner of James' mouth curled up as he let out a soft sigh of surprise. He hadn't done anything to offend the two older brothers in the short period of time he'd been in Vadamandri. As the men closed in, he had a reluctant, almost sorrowful thought. Well, I guess I have to get involved now. Episode 127, Dark Abyss. David's expression suddenly became wary. He noticed that as his thugs were walking towards James, there was no fear in his eyes. Not only that, even the three beauties standing behind him had calm expressions. There was not a single trace of concern on their faces. As the men closed in, James turned his head, smiled apologetically, and said to Vanessa, Krista, and Katie, "Why don't you go inside? I don't want you to get splashed with blood. It would ruin your clothes." He was not at all worried that they would be frightened by the impending violence. They had been with him on the island with the pirates, and Katie had witnessed his beatdown of the mafia goons in Hoboken. This stuff was becoming routine, and the ladies were now immune to it. The three women nodded nonchalantly and retreated into the building. They had known him for so long, they naturally understood what he was thinking. By this time, the first thug had reached him. He came forward and launched a swift roundhouse kick. James could tell that the guy was an expert. Even though he was dressed in a suit, his movements were agile and lightning fast. It was obvious he was not some ordinary brawler. He was a trained fighter. As the kick approached his head, James simply lowered his body and swiftly dodged the attack. He stood up suddenly. His right hand firmly grabbed the attacker's leg in midair. His left hand grabbed the thug's clothes at his waist. Then James lifted him clear off the ground. He rushed towards the other thugs and heaved their helpless friends straight at them. A dozen men were knocked to the ground by the impact. Then James waded in and finished the job. It was over in less than a minute. They were scattered on the pavement, rolling and wailing in pain. There were broken arms, dislocated joints, and busted ribs. It was actually kind of horrible to look at. James wiped the dirt off of his hands and looked at David and Draka calmly. A harmless smile appeared on his face. They were staring at him, their eyes almost popping out of their sockets. How did this man even do that? "What kind of terrifying man did we provoke?" David murmured to his brother. This fellow had looked harmless standing there with these beauties. Apart from being somewhat handsome, there seemed nothing special about him. But who knew that this handsome hunk would end up being a pro fighter? And his actions just now were anything but ordinary. He and Draka knew the background of the men strewn on the ground. They'd spent a lot of money to hire them from a shady organization on the mainland that rented out henchmen for special jobs. They looked like ordinary thugs, but in reality, many were former Special Forces soldiers. And now they had been beaten to a pulp by this guy in front of them in less than half a minute. David gaped at the carnage and swallowed. His mouth was dry because of fear, while Draka looked like he was going to puke with fear. Durham, on the other hand, had a look of shock on his face, but he was quite happy with the turn of events. It gave him a shot of courage. He resumed struggling, but he still could not break free from their clutches. James did not say anything. He just walked slowly towards David and Draka. The thugs who were still holding on to Durham immediately released him and charged towards James. Two solid muffled sounds rang out. The result was predictable. James casually stepped over the men screaming in pain on the ground and approached David and Draka step by step, intimidating them. Their faces went pale, and they looked like they were going to pee their pants. Just as the brothers were about to kneel on the ground and beg for mercy, James pivoted towards Durham and patted him on the shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "We should complete the paperwork now, right?" He didn't even look at the trembling brothers as he led Durham to the building. Before they could go inside, a man who'd been standing unobtrusively with the group spoke up. "Friend," he said, "you hurt my people. Are you planning to leave just like that?" James had not paid attention to him before, but as he spoke, James and the others halted. He wore a peaked cap, which obscured his face somewhat. He just stood there quietly. He looked quite mysterious. James could feel that his aura was calm and steady. He knew instinctively that he was even stronger than the hired thugs he'd just beaten up. The middle-aged white man took off his cap, revealing his shiny bald head and weathered face. Below his left eye, a strange tattoo instantly caught everyone's attention. It was an upside-down crow. Its outstretched wings and head extended onto the cheek below. Its feet were vivid and lifelike. Positioned near his eye, it was especially weird. James immediately thought of those world-class international villains in blockbuster movies. In fact, he was indeed an assassin, perhaps the most feared one on the planet. Only his name was enough to send chills down anyone's spines. His name was Martin McClure, and he was a member of the most ferocious criminal organization in the world, the Dark Abyss. He had an infamous reputation in the shadowy world of international crime and was on both the FBI's and Interpol's most wanted list. But none were able to get him yet. It was said that he had once killed 20 international tycoons in a single night and escaped without a trace. From then on, he became the top assassin for the Dark Abyss. But James was oblivious to these facts. Facing this ominous newcomer, he just smiled and casually said, "Yes, I am planning to leave them just like that. Is there a problem?" Episode 128. It's purely a misunderstanding. The Dark Abyss was the most mysterious criminal syndicate in the world. No one knew where its headquarters was, including McClure, but it had its tentacles in many parts of the world. The group's local branches played two roles. The first was to act as the conduit through which clients paid for its assassins, and their work did not come cheap. The second was to carry out ordinary money-making operations to fund the organization's general expenses. The guys who were beaten down by James just now were members of the South African branch of the Dark Abyss. Even though he remained calm on the surface, McClure could obviously see how powerful James was. It was troubling. He smiled and said politely, "No, there's no problem. I wanted to fight you because I just saw how good you were at it." His intent was more sinister. He wanted to kill James. "Boring," James threw out contemptuously. He did not want to waste any more time talking to this tattooed freak. He turned and walked towards the company's main entrance. After all, he needed to get the company business concluded as soon as possible. Once everything was settled, he wanted to enjoy the countryside with the girls. He had already searched on his phone and found in western Madagascar the city of Morondava and its avenue of the baobabs. It was one of the world's classic hikes. James had been eager to see these magnificent trees for a long time. He knew Vanessa, Katie, and Krista would love them. Before James could reach the door, McClure slyly reached into his back pocket. With a flick of his wrist, a short knife silently appeared in his right hand. Under the morning sun, the sharp blade shone with a cold light. The moment the knife appeared, he rushed towards James, who had exposed his entire backside to the attack. James did not know his adversary was a trained assassin. He could only sense that he was a formidable opponent. McClure was on James's back in a flash. His knife had slashed like lightning at the right side of his neck. His target was the carotid artery. It was the main vessel for blood to the brain. If cut, James would soon lose consciousness and eventually bleed to death. But James seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. He did not make any unnecessary movements. He moved his neck only an inch to the left and easily avoided the fatal blow. In fact, the moment that McClure acted, James already knew what he was going to do. After obtaining his special skills, his extrasensory perception had become unusually strong. Even without looking back, he could tell what was happening behind him. McClure was shocked. With a twist of his wrist, the blade slashed downward at James's left leg. The target this time was the femoral artery, which could also lead to unconsciousness and death if severed. His second attack was as fast as the wind, but James only took a step forward and dodged it easily. McClure was an expert killer. He did not give up. This time he lowered his body and spun around. In an instant, he was in front of James. The sharp knife sliced towards his throat with a whistling sound. The assassin was certain this attack would land. He expected a thin line of blood to appear on his victim's throat. But he missed again. McClure was shocked. He rarely used a knife to kill these days, but when he did, he always succeeded. James looked at his baffled attacker and asked with a grin, "Dude, what's with the knife? Do you have a grudge against me or something?" Despite appearances, he wasn't taking this lightly. The attack just now was deadly, its intent clearly to kill. Outsiders couldn't see it, but James knew very well how dangerous this guy was. McClure was jolted by James' insolent words, but he tried to meet them with similar nonchalance. "Ha, friend. It's purely a misunderstanding," he said while squeezing out a trace of a friendly smile. "I saw that you were good at fighting, so I was interested to see how I'd do compared to those other guys. I'm sorry, I just got a little too excited." There was no sign of it coming. James lashed out like a cobra and struck McClure across the face, hard enough to stagger him. He raised his hand and gently blew on it. "Yeah, well, next time try to contain your excitement," he said. McClure used his hand to wipe away the blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked at James with fury in his eyes. But he was the top assassin in the world. He knew how to handle himself in any sort of violent situation. Even though his heart was filled with killing rage, he quickly composed himself. It was because of his calmness that the injured thugs lying on the ground did not dare to breathe. Even their painful wails were stuck in their throats. They were afraid of disturbing the famous McClure. Before McClure could say another word, James slapped him in the face again. This time he could not bear it anymore. In an instant, the hidden rage within was released, but he didn't move. He was unsure, and he was not used to that feeling. James still had a leisurely look on his face. He raised his hand and blew gently on it once again. "That's in case you didn't hear me the first time," he said. James looked as if he were examining a piece of art he had carved. He did not treat McClure as a person at all, let alone a threat. After that, he placed a hand on Durham's shoulder, and together they strode into the main hall of the Vadomandri Sapphire Company. McClure's face was flushed red from the slaps, but he did not do anything excessive. Instead, he looked deeply at James's back. No one understood the meaning behind his steady gaze. In his eyes, James was already a dead man. Episode 129, Shell Company. James had no idea Martin McClure intended to kill him. He simply was not in the mood to think about it. The moment he stepped into the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company, the check-in success sounded in his mind. The check-in has succeeded. Congratulations to the host for obtaining a 51% controlling stake of West Group. The relevant share certificates have been issued to the special items storage space on the host attribute stats window. The next check-in will be the Cape of Good Hope. Although James could not review the ownership certificate and other relevant information for his newly awarded company right then, it sounded very good. His priority at the moment was to accept ownership of this luxury sapphire company. Besides, he was not in a hurry. The world check-in journey was designed to take time. It was a process of tourism and enjoyment. There was no need to get worked up about anything, right? After taking over the Gemstone Company, he planned to bring Vanessa, Katie, and Krista on a tour of Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar. Then they would go to Morondava in the west and take a stroll of the Avenue of the Baobabs. Next on the agenda was to drive the yacht through the Mozambique Channel and around the southern tip of the continent to Cape Town, South Africa. As James was deep in thought, the elevator door opened. Durham reached out his hand and said respectfully, "Mr. Tucker, the elevator is here. This way, please." The look in his eyes had transformed from warm and welcoming to devotion and absolute respect. This was the guy who had saved his life. James just nodded at Durham, then entered the elevator with his hands behind his back. The three women followed behind. Durham was the last to get in the elevator, but he cast a worried glance over at the company entrance. Obviously, he was concerned his two ambitious brothers would continue to bring him unknown danger. James saw the worry in the man's heart. "You can rest assured they're not going to bother us. Let's complete the handover." In fact, he thought the one who might still cause trouble would be the guy with the eye tattoo. James had beaten him in humiliating fashion today, and he would not let it go easily. But he was not afraid of him at all. He knew he was stronger than him. James considered eliminating the root of the problem completely, but he knew he couldn't be so extreme. After all, he was overseas. It would be impossible for him to kill the guy in broad daylight. This was not a deserted island in the Indian Ocean. Killing someone now would bring him a lot of trouble. His thoughts were interrupted when the elevator doors opened onto the 10th floor, where the chairman's office was located. All of them entered the cabin. There, Durham respectfully invited him to sit in the chairman's seat. He then presented him with all the pertinent documents, including a summary of the company's history and general situation, the roster of employees, and all the other information necessary for a transfer of corporate ownership. James only skipped through it. He then noticed the three bored beauties sitting on the sofa opposite him and had an idea. "Ladies, help me take a look, please." He knew their individual perspectives would be valuable. Krista, of course, was an old hand at reviewing corporate documents from her time at Silverbell. When Vanessa was a young woman, her father had taught her how to manage a business. And Katie herself was in the process of starting a company. The women agreed to assist without protest. They were bored anyway and needed something to do to pass their time, so they gladly agreed to help. Vanessa waved a folder in front of James. "Hey, is this exploitation?" she asked. "I am still a child, you know." It made everyone in the office laugh. Although all three women were quite smart, Krista had the best handle on how to coordinate and arrange things. She divided the work amongst them. Vanessa was in charge of reviewing the staff information, while Katie was in charge of checking the company's sales channels, basic plans for development, and related information. Krista left the company's complicated financial records to herself. The office quieted down as everyone got to work. James sat in the chairman's wide chair, leisurely sipping his coffee and reading a brief history of the company. Durham just sat on a sofa waiting quietly. Occasionally, he added more coffee to James's cup. The women's efficiency was astonishing. In a short 30 minutes, the three of them gathered around the desk and summarized the situation of the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company. Vanessa said that the staff looked solid and good to go. Katie reported the sales channel and plans for development were all in order. Then it was Krista's turn. Her findings were both accurate and conclusive. The Vado Mondri Sapphire Company was an empty shell company. Its market value was essentially worthless. "How's that possible?" James murmured. He looked at Krista with shock in his eyes. The systems price for the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company was $100 million. But according to the records, the company he was taking over only had a total value of $1 million. And even that was just a house of cards. This was obviously impossible. When it came to financial matters, the system was always astute. It would be highly unlikely to invest in a shell company. There has to be more to it, he thought. James looked at Durham. He looked back with sincere eyes. She wisely couched her terms in complex financial jargon so only James would understand it. Durham had no idea what they were talking about. However, he was not coming across like a scheming person at all. James was very certain about this. It left him with only one thought. What should I do now? Episode 130. Sea, Wings, Heart. Host has received a secret agreement. Please check it as soon as possible. The sudden notification from the system startled James. God, don't mess around right now, he cursed in his mind. But wait a minute, a secret agreement? The system would not give him something for no reason. Perhaps the secret agreement was related to what was happening in front of him. James remained calm. He supported his head with his hand and leaned against the desk. He continued to look like he was deep in thought. In fact, his consciousness had already sunk into his brain. He quietly entered the attribute panel of the system and opened the secret agreement it had just issued in the storage space of the special items. It was a document. James opened it and saw that the contents were actually an agreement related to the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company. He scanned it quickly. The situation instantly became clear. No wonder Durham didn't know about it. It turned out that this secret agreement had been signed a year ago by the system with Dirka Raharasan, who was Durham's father and the president of the Vado Mondri Sapphire Company. However, the condition stipulated that the system would only give out the secret agreement after James discovered that there was a mistake in the company's accounts. "Sir, how would you like to proceed?" Krista asked with deliberate vagueness. Just as James was about to speak, the phone on the desk rang. The urgent ringing instantly interrupted his train of thought. Durham glanced at James, who signaled for him to answer the phone. The call did not last long. The person on the other end said only one sentence, and Durham responded simply, "Yes." Then he hung up. Durham looked at James and said respectfully, "Mr. Tucker, my father asked me to invite you to our villa. He wants to see you." James was not surprised. Because of the secret agreement, he already knew some things ahead of time. Now he was certain that Durham did not know about this matter. It had all been arranged by his father, Dirka. Half an hour later, they arrived at a villa on the coast of Vado Mondri. James and the others had just gotten out of the car when a nurse pushed a wheelchair over. An old man with white hair sat in the chair. "Hello, Mr. Tucker. I am Dirka Raharasan. I welcome your arrival." He looked like he was in his late 60s. Even though he was sitting in a wheelchair, he was full of vigor. He didn't look like he was feeble at all, as Durham's brothers had insinuated. "Hello, Mr. Raharasan. I'm James Tucker." He walked over and they shook hands warmly. After the group entered the villa, Dirka said to his son, "Mr. Tucker and I are going to the study to discuss some things. You stay and keep his companions company." "Yes, Father," Durham said respectfully. There was no one else in the villa. James guessed that this was not Durham's home, but a private residence set aside for company business. James looked at Vanessa, Katie, and Krista and signaled them to wait in the living room. He turned around and followed Dirka into the study on the first floor. The study opened onto a balcony facing the ocean. The sound of waves could be heard clearly. James took in the scenery outside the window and sat down. Dirka signaled for his nurse to leave the room and close the door behind her. Finally, they were alone. James switched to an informal tone, addressing the old man by his first name. Dirka, according to the agreement, you have 3 items that are equivalent to the market value of the company. Then, before he could finish his sentence, Dirka waved his hand and interrupted him. He said, Mr. Tucker, I have signed the agreement. I will never go back on my word. Although the reported value of these items is far higher than what the profit statements show, it is better to give them to you than let them to fall in the hands of those robbers. However, Mr. Tucker, these special assets are valuable. It is not too much to say that they are worth a small fortune. Are you going to assume ownership of them without taking any security measures? Robbers? Security measures? Dirka's words were brief, but they contained a lot of information. James instantly smelled danger. He had already predicted that this matter was not as simple as brothers fighting for the family property. Sir, you should tell me your story, he said. I think I have the right to know everything about the company. Good, Dirka said. You are a sharp individual. I like that. Like his youngest son, Dirka was also a sincere person. Clearly, he did not intend to hide anything from James. Suddenly, under James's surprised gaze, he stood up from his wheelchair. Actually, I am not paralyzed, he said. This is just a way to deceive the outside world. His tone was calm and professional. Indeed, he had the demeanor of a man who had been in business for a long time. Just as you expected, I did get into trouble, and all because of these 3 treasures. He slowly walked to a bookshelf in the study and pushed a concealed button. With a low rumbling sound of a hidden mechanism, the middle section of the bookshelf moved away. A small wooden door opened automatically, revealing a dark space about 3 feet square. In the space, 3 shiny treasures made James's eyes widen. He stood up. Even his breathing became rapid. There was no light in the dark space, but under the reflection of the light from the study, James could easily see what was in it. There were 3 of them. They were sealed in a thick glass box, quietly glowing in separate compartments. James could see that they were 3 gemstones of different shapes and colors. Moreover, he could tell at a glance that they were of extraordinary value. The first compartment on the left held a blue gem. It looked thick in front and thin at the back. Its rich color was like the deep blue sea. In the middle compartment, there was a translucent white gem. Its shape looked like a pair of open wings. James could tell it had naturally formed that way. It was extremely rare and extremely precious. In the third compartment was a red gem. Its surface was smooth, and it was shaped like a small heart. According to James's new master-level skill, he could tell these 3 gems were among the absolute rarest in the world. And their value, he estimated, was definitely worth more than $100 million. If he could get a large auction house to sell them, they would probably go for $100 million apiece. Dirka let James admire the gems for a few minutes before he spoke again. Mr. Tucker, let me introduce these to you, he said. The blue stone came from a deep mine in Myanmar. Because its texture is uniform and its color is like the sea, it is called the Tears of the Sea. The white gem is a diamond from a mine in South Africa. After a few twists and turns, 5 years ago I acquired it from an auction house in Johannesburg for $10 million. It's called Angel's Wings. The red gem is actually a relatively ordinary coral, but its features make it utterly unique. If you look closely, you can faintly see the pattern of Earth in it, so it's called Earth's Little Heart. Dirka took out the glass box and placed it on the desk. He pointed at James and said, "Judging by your expression, I could tell you are familiar with rare gems. Come over and examine them closely." Tears of the Sea, Angel's Wings, Earth's Little Heart. James studied them for a while. The more he looked, the more interesting he found them. In fact, the more he looked, the more shocked he felt. Dirka, these 3 gemstones of yours are worth more than $100 million. Are you willing to give them to me just like that? The old man sighed and said with a heavy expression, Rather than giving them to those cruel bandits, I might as well give them to you. Because I'm doing business with you, I can get at least $100 million. But if I do business with them, not only will I not get a single cent, I might even lose my family's life." His words made James realize the seriousness of the situation. He knew that behind every priceless gem, there is often unending karma and bloodshed. "Who are they?" he asked. "It's a long story," Dirka said. "Please allow me to tell it in full." Episode 131. A Long Story. Dirka went to a chair and sat down. He looked at James and said slowly, "I have to start my story at a point a little over 2 years ago. At that time, the Vadomandri Sapphire Company was a major corporation in town. In all of Madagascar, in fact. Its market value was $1 billion US. This is not an exaggeration. But a year and a half ago, a member of the finance department reported to me that there were loopholes in the company's financial accounts. There was a lot of money missing. I was angry, of course, and I ordered people to investigate the matter thoroughly. In the end, I found out that the masterminds were my eldest son, David, and my second son, Draka. They secretly transferred my company's profits into their personal bank accounts. I fired my sons. I wanted them to reflect on what they'd done to me, how they had shamed their own family. But they were my own sons, and I didn't want to turn them into the authorities. But on the night I announced their firing, I received an anonymous packet in the mail. It contained only a bullet and a card with the letters DN on it. Other than that, there was nothing else. Although I didn't know what the card meant, the threat of the bullet was obvious. I know my two sons. Although they regard wealth as their rightful inheritance, they would never threaten me like that. But then who else could it be other than them? I've done business all over the world, but I have never offended anyone to the point where they'd want to kill me. I felt there was something wrong with this, so I sent people to dig deeper into the missing money and its whereabouts. In the end, I discovered that the money ultimately flowed into an unfamiliar account. It was not under the control of my two sons at all. I suddenly realized the seriousness of the problem. I took the mysterious card to a friend of mine in South Africa. I've been doing business for many years and have accumulated many connections. Naturally, I know some capable people. My friend made some inquiries and brought me an even more shocking piece of news. It turns out that the card came from an international crime syndicate called the Dark Abyss. According to my friend, my sons have become what are called earners for this organization. James had been listening intently. "Earners?" he interrupted. "What is that?" "It's a term from the American Mafia," Dirka said. "It refers to people who reliably bring in money for a criminal organization. My friend told me that underground groups have many sources of income. Earners are just one element of a large network." Dirka paused and then said, "I was worried. I spent a lot of money hiring private investigators to find out what was going on. A few months later, I received another piece of news. I had been targeted by this Dark Abyss organization a long time ago. They had assigned their best assassin to it, a man named Martin McClure. I considered all the information I'd been given. In the end, I deduced that they probably targeted me when I bought the Angel's Wings in South Africa. And just a year ago, my speculation was confirmed. I received another threatening message. This one was actually a letter. It told me to hand over the Angel's Wings or my entire family would be killed. Not a single one would be spared. And at the bottom of the paper, there was a picture of an upside-down crow. Dirka's eyes looked tired. Even retelling the story brought back his latent fear and stress. In order to deceive others, he continued, I faked my own paralysis and began to drive the company to the brink of bankruptcy. At the same time, I hid the 3 valuable gems. But I knew in my heart that the Dark Abyss would eventually get to me no matter what I tried. I didn't think I could keep the gems hidden forever. So I made up my mind to sell the company. But because everyone knew it was about to go bankrupt, there were no takers. Just when I was in my deepest despair, you appeared. You made me a fair offer, and it touched my heart. I knew I wouldn't be able to prevent the Dark Abyss from stealing the stones, so I figured I might as well give them to you. James could only frown. But the value of these gemstones of yours, it's astronomical. I must compensate you for them somehow. I'd like to have all 3 of them, but frankly, I don't have that much money right now. Haha, you're overthinking it, Mr. Tucker, Dierka said. Since I have an agreement with you, I will not go back on my word. What? What do you mean? James asked. As long as you can provide adequate security measures for them, the gems are yours. I've already said that I would rather give them to you than have them be stolen by those criminals. You were willing to buy my company and help me when I was at my most vulnerable, and I appreciate it deeply. James felt that his luck quota had been entirely filled with this astonishing windfall, but he was in no hurry to speak. Instead, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "Can I ask for your help?" Dierka's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "Tell me," he said. "I need to deal with some troublesome things tonight," James replied. "So my 3 female friends will need to stay here with you." After he made the request, he got up and walked out of the study without waiting for Dierka to answer. James entered the living room where the women had been waiting. "Vanessa, Katie, Krista, I've made arrangements for you guys to stay here tonight. I'm going out to take care of some things." The women started to ask questions, but James cut them off. "I know what you're going to say. Yes, I'd said that I would never abandon you no matter what, but this situation is a little different. Don't worry. I'll be back to pick you up first thing in the morning." Vanessa tried to speak, but then she jumped into his arms and said, "I can't bear to part with you." James hugged her and stroked her hair. "Trust me, Vanessa," he said. "Tomorrow I promise to bring you a souvenir you will never forget." Katie and Krista also looked pitiful as they hugged him from both sides. They did not care about Dierka and Durham at all. Now that they had battled with pirates, escaped from the sea, and survived on a deserted island, they had become extremely reliant on James. Moreover, their relationship with each other had become close, like sisters. Therefore, they were willing to obey this man and share their love for him. There was no jealousy between them at all. James held them in his arms and kissed them one by one. Watching this scene, Dierka and Durham were speechless. It wasn't especially rare for a person to have a few women in his life at the same time, but it was rare for those women to get along so well with each other. James touched all their faces tenderly and let them go. And the emotional farewell in the living room ended just like that. "Dierka," James said, "I'll leave their safety to you tonight." Episode 132. Whose grave? Dierka was back in the wheelchair. The nurse had pushed him out to the car to see James off. "Don't worry, Mr. Tucker," he said. "No one else knows about my villa. There is also a secret way to escape if necessary. Leave their safety to me." James got into Durham's car. Vanessa, Katie, and Krista watched until it disappeared around the corner. In the car, James felt much more relaxed without having the women along to worry about. He was confident he could get rid of all of their troubles tonight. The interior of the vehicle was quiet. James was thinking about everything Dierka had told him. The picture of the crow on the threatening letter Dierka received indicated it had been sent by this Martin McClure, who James now knew was the Dark Abyss's top assassin. And the reason why he, an assassin who'd apparently killed countless people, had been associating with Draka and David and did not attack Dierka's family was simple. He had yet to find what he wanted. James was still deep in thought when Durham, who was driving, turned to him and asked, "Where are we going now, Mr. Tucker?" "Back to the hotel," James said. He knew that Durham's every move was probably being monitored by McClure's people. The assassin probably also knew that James was going to stay in the hotel that night. In fact, the villa where the women were staying may have been exposed to the killer long ago. So why did he not make a move? James believed that the villa was not as simple a dwelling as it looked. Since Dierke dared to live there so openly, he must have had something there to rely on for protection. Plus, James was sure that McClure would come to settle accounts with him first. He was a top dog in the underworld. He could not let the disrespect James showed him go unpunished. James lay quietly on his bed in the hotel. Time passed slowly. He would be going head-to-head with a world-class killer, and this time his opponent knew what to expect from James. He wondered how dangerous his methods would be. But to be honest, James was confident. He was even a little excited about what was about to occur. For various reasons, he believed that the assassin did not display his full strength during their first encounter during the daytime. At night, everything would be different. Vadamandri was situated by the sea. The weather was known to change quickly. Soon it began to rain. The rain got heavier and heavier. James looked at the water dripping from the window. Somehow it was an ominous sign. The night was not going to be peaceful. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he walked over to the window. He watched the empty street below, lost in thought. Suddenly, he felt a faint pain in his forehead. He instinctively took a step to the side. As soon as he did, a bullet smashed through the glass and drilled into the quilt on the bed. James ducked for cover and got behind a solid wall in an instant. "That was close," he whispered. Because the bullet was moving so fast, it had passed through the window without shattering it, leaving only a small hole. The quilt had exploded into a cloud of down and cotton. James knew that the shooter must have been lying in ambush. Moreover, because there was no gunshot, the gun must have been equipped with a silencer. He relied on his special memory to remember the scene he saw outside just before the shot. He wanted to figure out where the gunman was hiding, then sneak over and kill him without anyone noticing. It didn't take long for him to sort through the images in his memory. The shooter was hiding on the roof of a 10-story building about 1,000 yards away from the hotel. It was a commercial building. Although it was bustling during the day, there was basically no one there at night, so it was a perfect place to construct a sniper hide. Even from such a long distance, this marksman was able to lock onto his forehead. He also had to calculate the effects of rain, wind speed, and other factors before taking the shot. This type of mastery put him among the elite of the world's snipers. But so what, James thought. Tonight, his fate had been decided. James put on a pair of gloves and a black hat. He turned off the lights in the room, went downstairs, and slipped out of the hotel unnoticed. James took the stairs to the roof of the building where the shot had come from. He had no idea if the elevator had been tampered with, and he didn't want to be trapped in such a vulnerable place. Just as he was going up, he saw a figure coming down the stairwell diagonally opposite him. James quickly descended to the ground floor and exited the building through a back door into a narrow alley, which he followed out to the street. He avoided all security cameras the whole time, like a ghost passing through the night. But just as he emerged onto the street, in the shadow of a building on the opposite side, a figure wearing a black mask gave him the middle finger. Then he retreated into the darkness, speeding toward the seaside. "Interesting. He sees me too," James whispered to himself. Then he sped in that direction as well. There was a great chance this guy was Martin McClure. James was impressed by the assassin's skills. He actually predicted I would come out of that alley ahead of time. There's no doubt he is an experienced killer. The rain suddenly became heavier. There was even the sound of rumbling thunder adding to the sense of endless danger. I wonder how James is doing. In the bedroom of the villa, Vanessa cupped her pretty face in her hand. "I hope he's fine," Katie said, and walked to Vanessa's side to comfort her. She looked at the rain outside the window, which was getting heavier. Her eyes were full of worry. Sitting on the bed, Krista said, "Don't worry, you two. He will be fine. I believe in his ability." She was always the calmest of the three of them. It was partly because James had told her that if anything ever happened to him in the future, she must take care of Katie and Vanessa. But when she lay back on the bed, she prayed softly in her heart. "I was just guessing. You have to come back safely." On opposite sides of a remote street in Vadamandri, two figures rapidly moved toward the shore. Neither of them spoke to the other. Soon they stopped close to a pile of rocks by the beach. The masked one turned around and looked at the other. Then he slowly took off his mask. A bolt of lightning suddenly exploded in the sky. It illuminated the bald head and demonic tattoo at the same time. It was Martin McClure. The assassin let out a strange laugh. On this cold and rainy night, he sounded like the devil himself. "Haha, the grave I chose for you is not bad, right?" James laughed himself. "Ha, you indeed chose well. If I die here, I will be able to see the ocean. Except..." A tickle of unease crept into McClure's mind. In the past, his victims always groveled for mercy. This guy was different. Not only did he feel any fear from him, there was even a strong sense of danger in the air. "Except what?" McClure asked. "Except," James said, "this place is not my grave, but yours." With that, he charged towards McClure. The Deep Abyss assassin was an experienced killer. Although James was faster than anyone he had ever seen, he didn't panic. He just stood where he was. This made James feel a little surprised. McClure had seen what James was capable of. Facing his attack this time, he was able to remain calm. It was obvious he had something else to rely on. James's first move was merely a probe to test his opponent's skills. He threw a half-power punch at McClure's face. Still, it would have been very difficult for an ordinary person to dodge it. However, when his fist was less than 3 inches from its target, the assassin stepped at a strange angle and dodged the punch. His entire body turned into a snake in the air. Suddenly, he lowered himself and turned around in a twisting arc. In the blink of an eye, he was behind James. While he was in motion, McClure shook both of his hands. 2 wicked knives appeared. Although the blades looked small, they were razor sharp. Even in the rainy darkness, they still flickered with a deadly light. The knives cut through the black night like 2 lightning bolts and slashed at the back of James's neck at an indescribable speed. He could instantly tell what was going on. This guy must have held back before. His speed now was at least 10 times faster than what he displayed during the day. This fellow probably didn't use his full strength then, so he could probe James's abilities. As an international fugitive, he also didn't want to gain the attention of the authorities by provoking unnecessary trouble. But for someone like James, his methods were still weak. James rolled on the ground. Then his entire body spun in an unusual manner. When he appeared again, his hands were already on his opponent's neck. McClure was an expert killer. He knew he was done for, but he made one final move to save himself. He suddenly flipped the knives in his hands and thrust them towards his own neck. He wanted to stab James's hands, forcing them off his throat and bloodying his enemy so he could move in for the kill. But at that moment, James removed his hands from McClure's neck. With the sound of 2 blades cutting deep into flesh, 2 thin lines of blood appeared on the assassin's throat. They instantly enlarged in the next moment, shooting out towards the void like 2 bright red flowers, only to be quickly extinguished by the violent rain. McClure covered his throat with both hands. In the end, his pupils enlarged and he fell powerlessly to the ground. Not only did this infamous killer of the underworld die here, he also died by his own hand.